Well, thank you all for coming. Really, thank you guys for coming. This is an amazing turnout, more than we had hoped. And this has been a bit of a dream of mine to lead a comics workshop for adults at the Ann Arbor District Library. And let me jump on that by saying, not every library has been as receptive to comics programming as the Ann Arbor District Library has. So I want to thank them, and I think we should all thank Sharon and the Ann Arbor District Library for allowing this kind of content to exist. Just your turnout alone has shown that this is something a lot of people are interested in, and it's great that they're providing this free opportunity for you guys to learn more about making comics. So what are we going to do today? Well, as the title suggests, my thesis for you today is going to be why comics are so great. And what we're going to do at the top is my intent is to open up your minds a little bit about what comics are, what their potential is, a few things that comics can do that no other medium can do, which is why I have spent the last 16, 17 years of my life thinking about nothing but comics. And we're going to be doing a little bit of drawing, but I promise that it will be a low-risk activity for you. And let me start with that by saying, who here has never drawn before? Who here likes to draw? Who here thinks they're pretty okay at it? Not too shabby. Who here has ever drawn something that said, oh my God, I have no business picking up a pencil. I should cut off my hands and move to the Himalayas and be a monk. I do this for a living. I'm also a freelance illustrator, which means I get paid to draw pictures, which is a pretty cool gig. But that doesn't preclude me from feeling terrible about my work. I don't know if you guys remember, I think we got adults in here now, so I can actually talk about old stuff. The Sesame Street character, Guy Music, he was the piano player who was trying to get the nursery rhymes right, and he never gets it right, and he bangs his head into the piano. That's the life that you guys are about to enter as a comic book artist. I always say to my students, welcome to hell, as with any art form. So, okay, first I want to, I see some familiar faces here. This will be old stuff to you, but for the newcomers, I wanted to address this point. This is important, and this is probably the most important point about comics, at least in my mind. We have here two comic book pages. There's one on the left, one on the right. And I want you to look at those two pages, and I want you to decide for yourself which one you like better. There's no right or wrong answer when I'm in the room, providing you can tell me what you were thinking, saying, oh, just because that's all, that's not an answer. You have to tell me your reasoning behind your choice. Which one do you like better? And when you have an opinion, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll be glad to discuss it with you. What are you thinking? So you like the one on the left, one because you like pencil, yeah. Okay, and there's something that's clear about it? Is that what you're driving at? When you say the one that you like the aesthetic of pencil better, is that to say that you don't like color, or you don't like the way that color is used?
I like color, not that kind.
What kind is it? Let's define it real quick. It's a little slick. It's definitely been touched by pixels, yeah? Maybe it's a little on the garish side, would you say?
Maybe, yeah, maybe
a little extreme. Okay, so that's a perfectly valid opinion. Ooh. Why is that? Why don't you like the text boxes? Well, that could be partially to do with the screen here, but it's also white text on a purple box. White text is difficult to read over dark backgrounds. Okay, very good reasons. Anybody else have a different opinion, or they want to bolster that opinion? Yeah. Oh, so to your eye, it's not clear where we should go next from text box to text box. Den? That's quicker and clearer. Does anybody like the one on the right better? Got a couple people. I want to hear from somebody who likes the one on the right better. Yeah. It looks more finished to you? Yeah? Does anybody think the one on the right looks more professional? Yeah? A lot of us agree that. But taste-wise, some of us like the one on the left better. Do these look like they were drawn by the same person? Do they look like they were? No, they were drawn by the same person. I drew the one on the left, and I drew the one on the right. I drew the one on the left when I was 11 years old, and I drew the one on the right just a couple years ago. And the point of this little exercise is this. One, when it comes to drawing, you're going to get better just by doing it all the time. And it doesn't matter when you start. It really doesn't. It just matters how intense you're going to take it, how much time you're going to put into it, and how much attention you're going to give to it. But if you have those things, like any skill, riding a bike, swimming, anything, you're going to get better just by doing it through repetition, just by drilling. I did not go to art school. I dropped out of college. You don't need to be a highly educated person to do this, but you can self-educate. That's my point. And what's more is just by doing it over and over again, you're going to get better. There's the proof right in front of you. But another point to this is some of you liked my work when I was 11 years old better. And I'm going to get to that. But this is point number one. This is the first opening that I want to give you guys, is that you don't need to be a great illustrator to be a great storyteller. And job one of a cartoonist, a comic book artist, is to be a storyteller, not necessarily an illustrator. And what's more is that you could be a great illustrator, but a terrible storyteller. You could draw something that is lavish and beautiful, but as some folks here pointed out, if you don't give a clear directionality as to where your eye is supposed to go as a reader, you're going to lose them. And the moment you make somebody say, hey, I'm reading a story here, you've lost them. They're not lost in the story anymore, and then you never get them back. So being a good storyteller is the primary concern, and that's what we're going to be doing most of our investigations about, although there will be some drawing technique stuff that we cover throughout this next several weeks. But here's more to this point. Here are two wildly successful cartoonists. Matt Feasel is out of the Detroit area, Hamtramck. You can find him at most of the local comics events in the state. And this is his thing. He does stick figures. And he's got a lot of fans. Here's Jeffrey Brown. Jeffrey Brown, he's a little bit more illustrative. Some people argue that he's exceptionally good. Some of my students are huge fans of Jeffrey Brown. They think he's a terrific illustrator. Other people say, no, his stuff is very crude. But what's working here is that they know how to tell a story with whatever they got. And then that's what captures the minds of the reader. You're going to hear this in comics discussions. People are going to say, oh, the writing's more important than the art. No, that's still missing the point. Art and writing are the same thing in comics. You're writing with images, whatever images you got, even if it's clip art. There are comics out there that are made entirely of clip art, and what matters is how well those images are fused together to create an image in your mind, to create story in your mind. That's what's number one importance. One of the most popular comics on the internet is called XKCD. This guy makes a living just posting comics online. Wildly successful. Makes a lot more money than I do. And that's what his art style is. And what is it? Again, it's that convergence of image and word together. And he knows how to do it well, even with just stick figures. Now, I've spent 16 or 17 years working very hard on anatomy, on perspective, on rendering a shot, a viewing angle from as many different ways as I can. So you can look up, you can look down, and I make everything look relatively plausible. And drawing exceedingly detailed backgrounds that make people go, wow. It took a lot of work and a lot of study to get to where I am. And I did a graphic novel a couple years ago where a character in the story, this big abominable snowman named Jared, who is a bad guy, but he's actually kind of sweet, and he became a runaway popular character with my readers, I decided just for fun that I would do a series of comics as if Jared, this abominable snowman with the mind of a 3-year-old, what if he made some comics? This is like a la Family Circus, where Billy would write some comics. So I did this. Now, I showed you those pages before, where I showed how hard I worked to be as detailed and as good a draftsman as I am. I did this comic in crayon in 5 minutes. My readers went wild. When are you going to do more of those Jared comics? These were great. I love them. I'm like, are you kidding me? After all the study I did, that's all I had to do to win your hearts? But yeah, because it's the trick is, I mean, I could go into a whole technical dissertation here about how it's really difficult to get into the mind of a 5-year-old and try to write in that style and draw in that style and like really go back to the basics of storytelling. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that if you do it right, it doesn't matter what you use. You use crayons. And if you do it well, people are going to love it. And what's more is, I've yet to see an article written about why my comics rule, but XKCD, the stick figure comic, he has people writing up entire dissertations, thesis discussions on why his stuff is so awesome. So again, this is just to liberate you guys out of this sense that, oh, I have to be a great draftsman to be a cartoonist. Okay, this is point 2. Now, this is going to be old news for some faces in the room because I know that there are people here who already believe this, but this is worth underscoring. It's really worth underscoring because I honestly believe that there is... Has anybody here ever heard of a book called Seduction of the Innocent? Couple? Just to illuminate you guys into a little bit of our shared history, and now that you guys are all here, you're all going to become professional cartoonists, right? A little bit of our history, there's a dark period in the 1950s where a psychologist by the name of Frederick Wertham wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent, where he erroneously associated comic book reading with juvenile delinquency. So kids who committed suicide, kids who did drugs, he noticed that there were comic books in their house. So it must be that comic books informed this delinquency, of course, but as we know, those of us who are of the thinking sort, that correlation is not the same thing as causation. It turned out that everybody read comics back then, and he was doing a bad survey, but it caught the imagination of America, and there were comic book burnings. And the industry itself was almost destroyed by this, and they had to institute this thing called the Comics Code, where they regulate themselves with these very strict rules. So this is why, in the 60s, the Batman comics became so corny and campy, because they were writing stories for little kids. Batman couldn't go out at night, because that's scary. It's got to be friendly. It's got to be fun. We can't show child endangerment, so Robin can never actually be in any kind of real danger anymore. And it almost destroyed the industry for a long time. And that's also what made it so that we only have had superhero comics for a long time in the United States. We've been fighting that ever since. Like, all of us cartoonists have been trying to inject new, show people that comics can be about any kind of genre. But where I'm going with this is this. I think because of what happened in the 50s, there is this general sense of low self-esteem amongst comics people. And I'm not talking about anybody specifically here. But I think that in general, there's still this sense that we need to stamp out that says that it's just comics after all. It's just fun. And it's an art form. It's a medium. And just like books, just like films, just like all storytelling mediums, it can be about anything. And that's why I think it's worth underscoring. Even if we already know this, we need to repeat this to ourselves. What can it be about? Well, here's a memoir. It's in the library collection. It's Smile by Raina Telgemeier. It's the story of when she was a preteen. She was at a Girl Scout camp, knocked out a whole front row of her teeth, and for the next 4.5 years went through a lot of surgery from her preteen years into high school. And it's a really well-done story. It's a really well-told story about coming of age, as well as just documenting this horrible pain this girl went through with all this dental surgery. The 9/11 Commission Report. You guys have seen the 9/11 Commission Report, right? A book this thick, a million trillion words in it. Ernie Colon and Sid Jacobson sat down and converted the entire thing to a graphic novel. Now, Ernie Colon, you're going to hear me talk about him a lot over the next several weeks. This guy, he worked on Casper the Friendly Ghost in the 60s. He worked on a lot of superhero comics in the 80s. And now here we are in the 21st century, and he's doing the 9/11 Commission Report. This guy is so good. I honestly believe he's from another planet. He can't possibly be human and be that good. He's an amazing storyteller. Then we have Fire by Brian Michael Bendis. Brian Michael Bendis is really big in the superhero comics right now, but before that, in the 90s, he did a lot of thriller comics. And this is like one of those like the Bourne Identity kind of stories. And we're going to notice something as we progress through these in a moment. Galaxian by Tara Talon. This is a great comic. It's an online comic that you can read for free. And it's a science fiction story, a la Star Trek meets a little bit of manga anime style, Robotech, that kind of thing. It can be cute. This is a Nemu Nemu, one of my favorite comics on the internet. It's a strip comic. It's about these two adorable stuffed puppies who magically come to life and get into all sorts of misadventures. And the whole thing is just about how adorable these pups are. You've got adventure. My friend Sarah Turner, she recently completed this graphic novel called The Ghosts of Pineville, where she said, boy, you know what my two favorite movies are? Goonies and the Monster Squad from the 80s. I want to do a story like that with ghosts. And so that's what it is. But it's three kids, circa, I think it takes place in the 50s or 60s, so they go into a haunted house and get into an adventure and learn about themselves. We've got action. This is a comic that I worked on. I happen to be obsessed with telling stories that feel like Saturday morning cartoons of the 80s. I've spent the last 5 years of my life really trying to dissect and unbox that storytelling style. And those kinds of stories have a very unique story aesthetic to them in terms of color, in terms of layout. And then we can even have parody. This is Jeffrey Brown again. This is a comic he did called The Incredible Change Bots, which is a big Transformers parody, which he did in this very 8th grade style of using markers and putting all the art on one sheet of paper. I mean, if you go back and look at this, this is clearly, a computer has touched this. I did the lettering on the computer, I did the coloring on the computer, but Jeffrey Brown decided to do it all as if he was in, English class in 8th grade, and did it all on one sheet of paper with that marker style. And it's just this fun kind of send-up of the Transformers franchise. So comics can be about anything, any genre you can think of, and there probably is a comic that you could find in the collection that matches that genre that you like. But also, this is worth noting. Look at how different all these pages look. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why some kinds of storytelling styles, some kinds of visual styles work for some genres, and why they don't work for others. And we'll be exploring that over the next several weeks. Very quickly, I just want to put us all on the same page in terms of terminology. Because are they speech balloons or are they word balloons? Are they speech bubbles or are they word bubbles? This is something that we really need to be on the same page about. And this is a subjective thing, but I'm going to give you my subjective thing. So, comics. You're going to hear me talk about comics as an art form with an S on it. I got this from Scott McCloud. He wrote a book called Understanding Comics. I don't know if you've read it yet. If you haven't, you should. It's a really excellent book about the form of comics, the craft of cartooning, and it's told in comic book form. It's a really brilliant book. It's I think, one of the primary texts of our art form. Oh, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. So he uses comics in this way. When you're talking about the art form in general, whether you're talking about graphic novels, manga, whether you're talking about comic strips, whether you're talking about any kind of sequential imagery, anytime you have panels in a row that tell a story, that's comics, okay? Not comic books. I'm talking about the art form. So when you talk about painting, this is comics that we're studying here today. And it's plural in form, used with the singular verb. So comics is this, is the way you're going to hear me talk about it. I know that's really persnickety, but I think that these kind of definitions are important as we mature as a medium. A cartoonist is a comics artist. This is not an exactly precise definition, but it's one that works for now, because you can be a painter and a comics artist as well. But comics artist doesn't roll off the tongue. And what's more is a cartoonist is a person who uses image to tell stories, so I thought it works as good as any. So if you make comics, you are probably a cartoonist. Let's look at a comics page, the anatomy, the panel. It isn't a frame, it's a panel. And a panel is any singular moment in the story, although the weird thing is that they can actually have several moments within a panel. But it's essentially any moment that you decide to put a box around. So when you read Peanuts, you have 3 panels usually, 1, 2, 3. Sometimes the panel doesn't have to have a border at all. And the panel can have all kinds of borders. That's where we're going to be studying line later on. You can have a jagged border, and that means a certain thing. You can have a round border, and that means a certain thing. The gutter, that's the spaces between the panels. And what's really interesting is, you guys all heard of Alfred Hitchcock, right? Alfred Hitchcock is the master of doing things off camera. You'll hear somebody scream in the background. You hear a gurgling noise, the famous scene in Psycho with the girl getting stabbed in the shower. You never see that knife penetrator. All you see is the knife go up, you see her face scream, you see the knife go down, you see blood in the drain. It's what he didn't show you that made it the most interesting. That's what activated your imagination. That's how gutters work in comics. It's what you decide not to show, and it's the spacing of the gutters that makes comics work as a storytelling medium. Word balloons. That's the name that I like best personally, but you'll hear other people call them speech bubbles. Oh, there's a handout with all this terminology on it that I'll be handing out for you guys after the fact. So you don't need to be, I see pencils going, you don't have to write this down. But containers for dialogue. The interesting thing about word balloons is they're very similar to panels in that they can be any shape or size, or even any color. But we're going to get to some other ones that have really rigid rules around them. The caption box gets used a lot in comics, especially nowadays in American mainstream comics. And it can be used for narration, like Once Upon a Time, or Meanwhile at the Hall of Justice, or it can be internal dialogue, like a soliloquy. So it can be, like in this case, it's what my main character is thinking, and that, hence the quotation marks around his text. Next, we have an interesting one, the thought balloon. Now this one, unlike the word balloon, doesn't usually change its shape all that often. Most people, when they create thought balloons, they're relatively speaking that configuration, where it's a cloudy type balloon with 3 to 5 little dots pointing at the skull. And you don't see many variations on this. You do in manga a little bit, but in American comics, that's a pretty solid symbol that doesn't get a lot of modification. And then we have viewing angle, and this is something you're going to hear me be really uptight about in persnickety. I'm not going to yell at anybody. I'm not that big a jerk. But one thing that I think is language worth emphasizing is that you can hear a lot of people say from time to time, oh, comics are great because they're like movies. Oh man, comics are so much cooler than movies. And I say this to my young students all the time, like, no, you don't really feel this way, but this is the truth. I'd rather read a great comic than watch a great movie any day of the week. I don't care if you're talking about Empire Strikes Back. I'd rather read a great comic. Comics are so much more potent in their storytelling potential in my mind, especially if they're done by Ernie Colon. But anyway, so I think it's important, like you'll hear a lot of people say camera angles. They'll use film analogies to describe what we're doing in panels. I'd like to say viewing angle, just because there's no camera in comics, and we're not trying to be film. Film is not the final justification of a medium or a story. Comics can just be comics. Did it work with me, computer? There we go. Okay, now we get into some really interesting areas of what comics are going to do. This is something I hope you guys will play with in the subsequent weeks, is composition. When you go to a museum and you see a painting, let's say the Mona Lisa. Here's the painting sitting there. Do you start from left to right, top to bottom, and scan like a computer? No. You go wherever your eye is interested. That's what composition is. Composition is arranging elements so that it captures your eye and guides it around an image. The neat thing about comics is it gets to do that as well as observe the rules of prose. And this is where a lot of, when I teach, I do professional development for teachers where I teach English teachers how to use comics in their classroom. And a lot of English teachers, at least a certain proportion of them, will always say, I don't know where to go next on the page. Where do I start? That's one of the cool things about it, is that you can follow this kind of zigzaggy path through a page. And what's more is you can even defy reading direction, which we'll get to that a little bit later. You can actually go backwards and forwards and take this snake-like path around a page and play with composition to tell a story. Why would you do that? That's some of the interesting stuff we're going to talk about later on in the classes. And then we got sound effects. Sound effects are one of the most fascinating things about comics to me. We've all seen the article in the newspaper, bam, pow, comics aren't for kids anymore, right? We all think of Batman from the 60s with pow, wham. And yeah, that's cute. But you think about it from a sense of onomatopoeia. You say, well, let's just do this. I hope you guys will indulge me in pretending to be 10 years old for a moment. What sound does a lightsaber make? Does anyone want to say what it is? You got zhroom. You got zzz. Okay, now here's the next test, or the next level. How do you spell that? Okay, so it's going to be V-N-N-N, Z-H-R-O-O-O-M, Z-Z-Z-Z-Z. Okay, there's a couple different spellings we could try. Now, what kind of lines are going to use to make it feel like that sound? Okay, I'm going to use a jagged line that's electrical looking, or I might use a wavy line because I want it to have that kind of hum of presence. Okay, you got that. Now, what color is it going to be? How can I make this sound have the color of the quality of that sound? This is the kind of stuff that keeps me up late at night. I once spent something like 5 or 6 hours on one sound effect. Like, okay, should it be brown? Should it be blue? Okay, it's the sound of a cookie flying through the air at 100 miles per hour. Is that going to have an airy quality? Okay, what kind of airy quality? Oh, that's too blue. That has too much presence. This is the kind of the tunnels you can get lost on in making comics. And I think sound effects, I actually put on my website an anatomy of a sound effect. I should have put it in the presentation. Anatomy of a sound effect chart in how to think about designing sound effects, because it's just so endlessly fascinating to me. And then we've got emphasis within word balloons. Another interesting thing that you get to do, you get to play with tone, pitch, and timbre, and volume by virtue of the shape of the balloons. You'll notice that there's a starburst pattern balloon there with huge letters, but then the balloon on the far right has double balloons around it. What does that mean? And then also some text is bold, some text is not bold. Those are all pacing and emphasis cues for us. And this is why I like comics so much, as opposed to film, is that I get to put my interpretation on that dialogue, and I get to listen to these actors play it out in my head the way I hear it. How many of you guys have ever read a book, go to see the movie, and you say, that's not who I'd have play that character? And then somebody says, well, who would you have play that character? I don't know, but not that guy, right? Why do you say that? Because you have a picture in your head of who that guy is, even if you don't see it. And this is what's going on when you're reading a good comic, is those actors are all playing out in your head, and you hear those voices even if you don't think you are. And when you get lost in a comic story, you get to play every character on the stage and ascribe every voice you want to them. And so in that way, the cartoonist and the reader are active partners in the storytelling process. Does that make sense? It's kind of a highfalutin, kind of touchy-feely kind of way of putting it, but I like it. All right. We're going to do a little bit of drawing. We're going to do one mini exercise to get us warmed up and get used to this comic stuff. And again, this is going to be old stuff to some people in the room. But for those who are new, I make part of my living as a storyboard artist. What is a storyboard artist? Anybody have a guess? Does anybody know? What does a storyboard artist do? It's pre-visualization for television and film, yeah. So everything you see on TV, even commercials, because this is a storyboard from a TV commercial, there's been an artist involved who has pre-visualized all the shots for the director. And then the director takes the camera crew with the storyboard out, and they go and match those shots, okay? So it's a cheap way to pre-visualize your story. And this is a storyboard that I did for Taco Time Restaurant. There's one in Canton. I don't know if there are any other in Michigan. But that's not important. What's important here is that I want you to look at these 5 moments, rather. And this was the script I was given. So, Jersey, we need this thing first thing in the morning. Frame 1, girl's looking on the internet for a date. Frame 2, finds a handsome-looking guy and says, good enough for me. Frame 3, she gets ready for the date. Frame 4, ding-dong, the doorbell rings. She opens the door. In frame 5, the handsome-looking guy turns out to be this weird farmer with a pig under his arm. And the joke is, don't trust everything you see on the internet. That's not the point. I didn't expect any laughter out of that because I didn't think the joke was very good either. What's important here is that we look at these 5 moments and decide for ourselves which one takes the longest to happen. If you're watching this on TV, which one of these would take the longest? Not for me to draw, but to happen on the screen. And when you have decided for yourself, I'd like you to raise your hand if you'd like to offer an opinion on this. And remember, there's no right or wrong answer, providing you can tell me what you are thinking. You have to justify your choice. What are you thinking? Why? Okay, getting ready for the date because it could be a whole week before they see each other. Okay, so there could be an enormous amount of time that passed between the frame 2 and frame 3. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. That could be. Yes, that's a perfectly good reason. What do you think? Since frame 5 is the punchline, that might be it's the wah-wah moment in the story. So yeah, you might hang on that. That's perfectly good, reasonable choice. What do you think? Creaking of the door in 4. How come? Okay, in your mind it was creaking. And yeah, we don't know for sure how quickly she opens that door. Does she go, huh? Or does she go, arr? And when you think of a creaking door, you usually think of a slow opening door. So maybe that moment takes the longest. Perfectly good reason. What do you think?
I'm thinking number 4 also, but because they're trying to build tension, wondering what's going to happen.
Anticipation, tension, right. It might be a slow build to the big reveal, right? Okay, do we know for sure which moment takes the longest? No. There's not enough information there. I mean, she could be on a dial-up connection, and then browsing the internet takes forever. She might have gone through 400, 500 guys on the screen before she landed on handsome Ezekiel there. If the director said, I want her to brush her hair 600 times, she's really fastidious about her appearance, then that moment would take longer. But we don't know for sure. But now watch this. Which moment takes the longest to happen? I did not change any of this art. All I did was make it into a comics page. Now, which moment takes the longest to happen? I bet we know. Anybody take a guess? What do you think? How come? Wait a second. Are you trying to push on me that something big means it takes a long time to happen? You better justify this decision. Yeah? So bigger things, for some reason, they trigger our mind to say this takes longer, right? There's a reason for this. There's a biological reason for this. It comes from our daily experience. If you guys will indulge me for a moment, this may be embarrassing, but this is a classroom after all, and that's my job, is to partially to embarrass you guys. Close your eyes. We're going to do a thought experiment. I want you to imagine you're standing right in front of the Empire State Building, right in front of it. You're not flying above it. You're not hovering or standing on another rooftop. You're right in front of the front doors of the Empire State Building. I want you to look at the Empire State Building. Okay, now in your right hand, you're holding an apple. I want you to look at the apple. Okay, you can open your eyes, and I'd like you to tell me which one took longer to look at. The building. Do we agree on that? Why? I need some reasons. Size. What else? Apples in your hand? I know what this is. But if you're plopped right in front of the building, what is this thing? There's a couple people in the room going like this. You know? And that's the truth of the matter is that we're used to big things taking a long time to understand and review and take in. Also, there was a lot of detail on the thing, right? And this is what we're going to do really quickly as our assignment, our exploration into comics, is study this concept of why some panels are big and why some are small. We know that this is true, but I'm just putting a name on it. And the reason I put a name on it is because comics are so easy to read that it's deceptive, because what we're thinking when we're reading them is actually pretty sophisticated. We know that first panel is meant to attract our attention longer than that second panel, right? By virtue of the amount of stuff in it, and also because of its size. So when you use a panel in your panel sizing in your stories, you get to use them to say, stop, look, consider, wait on this moment for a second. You get to control the pacing of the reading experience through just virtue of size. There's another reason that you can make panels big and small, and this comes, again, out of our daily experience. What do you do with your body when you're telling a secret? When you're trying to be nondescript, not get attention to yourself, right? You get small. You go in tight and close like this. What do you do when you want to get somebody's attention across a crowded floor? You get big, you get emphatic. So size in comics panels, as in word balloons, words, and everything, size also relates to emphasis, importance, strength. Okay, so what we're going to do really quickly is we're going to do a 4-panel comic, and we're going to sketch. And I'm not going to go through these. What we're going to do is we're going to do sketching. For those who have never sketched before, thumbnailing in comics is, in my mind, where the real action of comics happens. All that stuff on the right, this by the way, these are 2 pages from a comic that I did with a buddy of mine, Mark Rudolph. And these are the thumbnails we did as we wrote the story. All that stuff on the right is purely mechanical stuff. That's just drawing to make it look like how we want it to look. But the creative decisions, what panel sizes we used, what moment choices we used, what viewing angles we choose, that'll happen at the sketch level. And this is my favorite part of making comics, is doing these loose, noodly sketches. Yeah, I like doing the finished stuff because then I can show it to people and they can read it. But the one on the left is, I think, where the real act of creativity happens. This is where you're writing with images. So we're going to do that right now with 4 moments. And for those who don't know what to do for their 4-moment story, we can work as a group and come up with a master script. So just to keep this thing fast and loose and fun, I need a character that we all know. Somebody throw a character at me that we all know. SpongeBob SquarePants, do we all know who that guy is? We have all seen him on a T-shirt at least, right? Okay, SpongeBob SquarePants, we need another character that we all know, a well-known character from television, film, mythology, etc. Abe Lincoln, very nice. Okay, SpongeBob and Abe Lincoln. Now we need a location. Where are they going to be? Where's this story going to take place? Where? The beach. SpongeBob and Abe Lincoln at the beach. And we need an action to happen. What is going to occur between these 2 guys? Story is about action and change. They play volleyball. Okay, so frame 1, or panel 1, I should say. Panel 1, we establishing shot, SpongeBob. I won't bother writing this down because I can't show it to you guys anyway. So I want you to jot this down on a piece of paper. SpongeBob and Abe Lincoln at the beach, panel 1. Panel 2, Abraham Lincoln says, hey, how about a game of volleyball? Panel 3, they play. In panel 4, one of them spikes the ball and makes the other cry. I don't care who. This is where you guys get to inject your own creativity. Spikes the ball and ends the game, making the other guy cry.
In one panel, both the spike and the emotional response are included?
Yeah. In one panel, both the spike and the emotional response are included. This is one of the challenges of comics, too. I once worked with a writer. One of the things, one of the reasons I like to self-publish nowadays is because I did my share of working with writers in the 90s, and writers would sometimes say, panel 1, 6,000 guys come down the hill, and we see all the glittering sparkles of their armor. We see all the family crests on their shields. We see the gleam in their eye. And panel 2, whoa, that's a lot of detail you just gave me just for one panel. Now there's going to be 9 more. Or they would say, Guy jumps into the air, does a spinning roundhouse kick, shoots fireballs out of his hands, lands on the hood of the car, and punches a girl in the face. Panel 2. You know, it was like, wow, how am I supposed to capture all that in one sequence? But this one should be doable, is the spike and the emotional reaction in one panel. Okay, so we'll take 20 minutes to work on this, and here's what I want you to think about. Which moment takes the longest? Which moment is the most emphatic? And that is how it's going to determine your size choices. I really want to see some size choices on these panels, not just all four the same size like a Peanuts comic strip. Sure, panel 1, SpongeBob and Abe Lincoln at the beach. And then panel 2, Abe Lincoln suggests that they play volleyball. Panel 3, they play volleyball. In panel 4, one of the characters spikes the ball, ends the game, and makes the other guy cry. And remember, loose sketches. We're not worried about drawing something so wonderful that mom's going to put it on the fridge, okay? We're just trying to get ideas on paper, just loose sketches. Use stick figures if you got it, because what this is mostly about is about exploring how size works in comics, not about how wonderful of a draftsman you are. Okay, so one of the things we're going to do over the 6 weeks is build a graphic novel from the ground up. Oh, wait, before I get to that, one more point about how comics are great. I'm sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. I don't know if anybody gets this joke, but I thought it was funny. But comics are great, after all, and there are many, many reasons why, and I wanted to put these thoughts in your head for further consideration over the next 6 weeks. This is a Walt Simonson, famous American comic book artist, mostly worked on superhero stuff, but he did some really interesting stuff outside of superheroes. But this is from a Fantastic Four comic from the 90s. And I wonder if anybody can spot for me what is the weird thing this guy did with composition. What is he doing that defies traditional reading directionality? It's not important that you can read it. I just want you to be able to look at the general flow of images. It's unfair of me just to give you a page out of sequence and go, hey, read this page and tell me about it. I'm just asking you guys to look at the general flow of the page and say, what's happening here that's weird? What is it? It's tall panels, right? And look at how he uses the word balloons to guide us where we need to go. As the Human Torch flies down, the next thing we see on the Human Torch's fingertips is Reed Richards' word balloon there to guide our eye down there. And then there's the swooshing lines in the next panel to guide us back up to that top panel on the top right. So you're reading in a snake-like configuration, top to bottom, left to right. Isn't that weird? And that's, again, this totally works. When you look at it, it makes sense. And then even using like compositional elements like that last panel where all those items, all the elements are moving in towards that circle at the center of that panel to say this is the point where everything stops, right? That's some cool stuff that you get to do. And I'm going to point out again, films can't do this stuff. Okay, this is one of the most interesting comic book pages I've ever seen in my entire life. It's done by Ernie Colon, again, from another planet. The guy's such a good storyteller. And one of the things he does here is something that films cannot do. For everybody who gets all excited about the new movie Blockbuster with all the shiny people in it, films can't do what this page does. And I'm wondering if we can spot what it is. Again, it's not terribly important that you read the text. Just look at the general flow of the word balloons and who's saying what, and see if you can spot what is being done on this page that you could not do in a movie. I know it's a lot to ask you guys, but we just take some guesses. What do you think? That is something that you have a flexibility with in comics that you don't have with film or television, is that there's a certain elasticity about how much text we can fit into a moment. A case in point, and this is an example I've used in the past, is I once read a comic in the 90s where a guy had a 5-page spread, meaning that you open the book and the page opened 5 times into this giant poster. And that poster consisted of, and this was actually a page from the story, the poster consisted of a woman ninja character kicking a guy in the face. And there were 12 word balloons around her as she was doing this Shakespearean soliloquy while kicking this guy in the face. Now, we know how long it takes to kick somebody in the face. Bam, it's done. We cannot quote a section of Hamlet while doing that. So that's where it kind of breaks down. It's a little bit stretching things too far. But we have a reasonable idea of how much time that first panel's moment takes, and we can push it a little bit by fitting extra word balloons in there. That's true, and that is something really neat. But there's something even more unique on this page, something that is such a brilliant little trick that I've been spending the last several years of my life trying to figure out how to introduce a similar trick into my own work so I can contribute to my medium. I saw a hand going up. What is it?
This is sort of happening all at the same, like, the drawing here is sort of contributing to multiple other situations.
You got it. The guy in the blue tunic with the gray skin. If we look at this page as a whole, he is acting in two different moments in the story. There's simultaneity going on here. In other words, Ernie Cologne found a way to use the same artwork for two different moments in the story. That's amazing. And that's something that, again, film cannot do. So, in other words, read panel 1. And then we go to panel 2, and this sorceress says, just to summarize the story, the guy in red is kidnapping this princess, and he says, I'll kill her unless you find a way to keep your troops from following me. And the sorcerer says, okay, fine, I'll root him to the ground. And then the guy with the gray skin, if you look, so you go panel 1 to panel 2, and then you go off to the right, and we see the gray guy responding to the sorceress. He says, witch mother, no, you cannot leave the princess at his mercy. And then we go back to panel 2, where she says, she will only be harmed if Carnelian reaches his father's fortress, which he shall not do. Then we move down to panel, I guess 3? Or is it 4? I'm not sure now. Because now the bad guy responds to her and taunts her. And then as he's talking and the last two word balloons rather, we see her slumped in the chair as he's talking to her. But she's part of the panel that the gray character is responding to her in panel 2. So the artwork gets used twice for the same storytelling moment. That's brilliant. I got so excited when I found this comic. And as a result, whenever I go to comics conventions, I try to find this issue to buy up as many as I can so I can give them to people to show them what we should all be thinking about as storytellers, is find ways to trick the reader into different reading directions and unique techniques that only comics offers. And finally, there's the last little part of my thesis about why comics are so great. This is, again, Walt Simonson from Fantastic Four comic, and this is, by a lot of people's standards, pure comics. Pure comics meaning that this is, again, something only comics can do. And just to bring you up to speed on the story, it's not important that you read all the text. Reed Richards and Dr. Doom are getting ready to fight, and they decide they're going to have a fight between the seconds. It's a science fiction story, after all. It's not just a superhero story. And they're going to fight in between time, and they put on these little belts, and the belts allow them to travel to different minutes of time. Now, if we look in the bottom left-hand corners of each page, there is a time stamp. So it says 1:05 a.m., 1:06 a.m. As you turn each page, it's a minute of time. So it goes progressively from 1:05 to 1:06, 1:07, 1:08, 1:09, right? But look at when Dr. Doom on the first page travels into time, it says 1:08 p.m., or a.m. rather. So this white strip occurs on the side of the page, and that becomes the battle in between the seconds for them. So, in other words, to find out where Dr. Doom went next, you have to turn to page 1:08 a.m. to find out the next part of the story. You can't read the white bar in traditional page direction order. The color part stays in traditional page direction but the white strip does not. I'm seeing some wrinkled faces. This is a confusing concept. But in other words, there's two ways to read the book. You can read it by turning to, okay, Dr. Doom just went to 1:25 a.m. In order to read the next panel, you have to go to page 1:25 a.m. And so on and so on. You wind up going back and forth throughout the book in order to read their narrative, whereas the color narrative maintains a traditional page direction. And then he wrote it even in such a way where the two parts of the stories interconnect. And so the Thing's interpretation of time is different than Reed Richards' interpretation of time. Just try to imagine writing that narrative, trying to figure out how to write that story to where the stories happen in two different orders, yet they still intersect at points. That's again, very, very exciting to me because films cannot do this. And that's another reason that I get a little exuberant about saying why comics are so great compared to film, because film is awesome, but ultimately I think comics does a lot of things better. For instance, there's this page again. This is that, when I showed you that composition thing earlier, where you can zigzag all over the place. I worked on this story with my buddy Mark Rudolph, and he did the layouts. And he did the layouts before I had a chance to really put in where the word balloons were going to go. So I was presented with this page where it's pretty difficult to see where we're supposed to go. Do we go panel 1, panel 2, panel 3 with that ship, and then panel 4 is the next ship? Panel 5, what's that rocket car doing there? Panel 6, and then panel 7, what's the direction I'm supposed to read this in? It took me a couple hours to figure out how to letter this page. And by incorporating the lettering, now where do we go? Now we can see a general flow. The word balloons guide us on where to go on the page. And I was really, really pleased with how this came together, because it was a challenge where, okay, I'm interpreting that these two vehicle moments with the vehicle schematics are actually simultaneous to the middle moment on the page, as is the rocket car. So the guy in the middle panel there is talking to the guy in the rocket car who responds to him over the radio. They're not really in the same room, but they're just juxtaposed to show that these two are having a conversation. So that's another thing that comics gets to do very, very effectively. We don't need to really mess with that one. But finally, this is where kids understand this intuitively. This is a recreation of student work with a fifth grader that I was working with, where he had these two characters being attacked by monsters. He gets on this diving board and falls down, does some kind of jump off of a flying ship, and then proceeds to go to the left. He completely defies traditional reading direction. And this was just intuitive to him. It made perfect sense to him. Why not? Because that's where the arts come in. Arts allow you to do that. Whereas traditional prose, there's rules about that, right? Unless you're reading E. Cummings. Okay, so now we're going to get to this whole business of building a graphic novel. And I'm not going to promise that you guys are going to walk out of here with a 192-page graphic novel, obviously, because a comics page, you wind up living with them, depending on the level of detail you put into them. You can live with them for 20 hours at a page. Or not, depending on the style, right? But I'm going to point you at a podcast that I do called Art and Story. And we did, me and my buddy Mark Rudolph did a series on there called Your Comic from the Ground Up. And on the handout, there is this link will be on there for you. So, but we broke it into 7 parts, the 7 steps to building a graphic novel. This is worth underscoring. Any artistic endeavor is not in a numerical order. And I am always suspicious of advice people give me where they say, hey, these are the 3 things you need to know to do such and such. And any knowledge really worth understanding is very web-like, and it's very interconnected, and there's no one path into anything. And always a starting point is always a artificial starting point. But you got to start somewhere. And so this is the best place that we could figure out where to start, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And what's more is this series, the first episode is 2 hours long. So it's a very in-depth discussion on where we start when we build our graphic novels that you guys will be able to follow up on later. But we're going to talk about, just briefly, the theme and the premise. These are the 2 different ways I like to start a story. Let me ask you guys this. Who here has a pretty good idea on what story they want to do? Who here has, I got a few characters, I'm not sure. Who here has no idea? Okay. Okay, good. We got a pretty good range of people in here, and I'm hoping that we can all work together on this. But if you don't know where to go, or if you've got just a few characters, you got a rough idea on what you want to have happen in your story that you want to tell as a comic, the way I like to work is back out 1,000 feet and think about what's the premise, or what's the theme, or what's both. What do I mean by theme? The question or the argument of your story. And I think about argument being a really interesting word to think to address your story with, because if you come up with an argument or a question that you want to address in your story, in other words, like, let's say, I think the Vietnam War was bad. That's what I want my story to be about. Or I want to say that I once had a conversation with a guy who was a Marine, and I was telling him about the science fiction epic I was working on. It was all about war. And he said, don't tell me you're going to do one of those stories where you say war is bad. And I said, well, why do you say that? He's like, well, because war is necessary sometimes. There's a theme. War is necessary sometimes. Now I've got an argument, and I can populate my story with characters who will debate this argument through their actions. That becomes a story-building mechanism. So if you will say, sometimes war is necessary, now that gives me an inroad to start saying, well, who would say yes to that? Who would say no? Who do I know in my life who would say yes to that, and who would say no? Now I can start to create characters based on people that I know. That's always a good informant. And through the things they do in the story and the conversations they have, they will be addressing that central idea. This central idea is not important to use as a didactic mechanism. You're not trying to, you don't necessarily feel like you have to be swaying anybody's opinion. But what I like to use a theme for is as a grounding point. If I'm lost and don't know where to go next, I go back to that central theme. What is this story about? And this is what the Pixar folks do all the time, supposedly. I haven't been in any of the discussions, but they always say, what is the story about? Story can also be about premise, the situation. This is a story, in the case of Raina Telgemeyer's Smile, this is a story about what happened to me when I was in the Girl Scouts and I busted all my teeth out. Not really a central theme there necessarily. It starts with an experience that you had. And that can be the informant on your story. But either way, I like to come up with one sentence that says, this is what the story is about. And then whenever I need a new idea or I'm stuck on which choice to make, I go back to that central idea. Okay, so the theme is the story's aboutness, and the premise is the story's setting and the main character's problem. The boy who enters junior high and he's got a crush on the pretty girl, but she won't give him time of day. That's just as valid a story as Frodo Baggins going off to Mordor to get rid of the ring. Now let's talk about some questions I like to ask myself about my characters in order to start generating ideas. And a lot of these are adventure character examples, but I think these apply to, again, whether you're talking about a nerd in school, whether you're talking about yourself as a child, whether you're talking about some guy at the office, all of these things hold true, and that's why adventure stories work so well, is because they speak to general human truths, but just with big explosions. So first we got the redemption character. The redemption character is a person who, gosh, I could spend 20 minutes on this, but my friend Sarah Turner, another comics artist, she put it beautifully to me on the phone the other day. She said, they're the guy who has to get over something. They got some kind of thing that went wrong in their life or a bad decision that they made, and they can't let it go. That pain sticks with them. And then an opportunity in the story presents itself for them to make the right decision and thereby fix all the bad stuff that they did. Everybody talks about Darth Vader being a good redemption character. Yeah, he's okay. Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, Professor Snape from the Harry Potter books. People who do something that we think is absolutely irredeemable, something awful, and it eats at them. They usually think that they're presented with the option to do good, and good just doesn't fit them for some reason. It's not a proper fit. They mess it up all the time, and they have to grow as a character into being good in their way. That usually happens a lot with a redemption character. There's the dissent character. It's the opposite of the redemption character. And this is the character who starts out doing things pretty okay, but inevitably they make that bad mistake that's going to haunt them for the rest of their life. Not all stories have to end happily. It is my opinion that the story just has to end sensibly. It has to be the right ending. Have you guys ever heard of the movie What Dreams May Come, Robin Williams, from a few years back? And just to bring everybody up to speed, the story is that he dies, and his wife is so distraught by this she commits suicide, and he's informed by these heavenly agents that she's in hell now and she can't come out ever. And he's like, well, I'm going to go get her. And so he goes on this quest to get his wife's soul back. And in the end, he finds her, and it turns out that hell isn't like a fire and brimstone place. It's a place that's just so loaded with despair that you can't even move. You just get overcome by it. And he starts talking her out of it. He's trying to talk her out, and then finally he starts succumbing, and then she comes out of it for some reason and says, no, let's go. And so they get out, and then they're in heaven at the end. Apparently there was an original ending where he succumbs to the despair, and he's stuck down there with her forever. And audiences hated it because it was a sad ending. I thought, what a beautiful ending, that he had a love so powerful for this woman that he would endure hell forever for her. That is a beautiful idea, but it's a sad idea. Well, okay, that's one of the problems of American mainstream film, is that you got to please the widest number of people in order to financially justify your endeavor. But in a comic story, you can deal with a much smaller audience, and you can have an unhappy ending providing it's the right ending. That's the way we should think about it. So a dissent character works just as good. The common link between redemption and dissent is that there's a line in the sand that they will not cross. And the climax of their arc as a character is crossing that line. So when the redemption character says, I'm just a bad guy, after all, I've made a lot of bad choices, I'm hung up on this thing, I can't change. The opportunity presents for them to change and become a better person when they finally take that, and that's usually a climactic moment in the story. And same with the dissent character. This is one thing that I will never, ever do under any circumstance, and then need or some kind of personality weakness compels them to cross that line, and now they're ruined forever. Aspiration and terror. These are, like I was saying, these are 4 questions that I like to ask myself about my characters. These aren't the only kind of characters that exist. These are just 4 categories I like to run all my character ideas through to see what comes out. A great orator once said that the 2 things that unite a society are aspiration and terror. Aspiration built the cathedrals. Aspiration built the pyramids. We could talk about slave labor and other things like that, but who came up with this idea to build something so big? Right? Aspiration, that unites people, makes people come together to build something. Terror pushes people apart. Terror is, if you do such and such, the terrorists win. That kind of rhetoric that you hear every once in a while, that's where we are today. So This also works for characters. What does your character aspire to? What do they want? What are they searching? What are they after? Are they the nerd who wants the good-looking girl? Are they the new girl in town who wants to be with the popular kids? Are they somebody who is told, like Theseus, go and quest for your father, which was then used around Luke Skywalker in Star Wars? What do they aspire to? And an aspiration character usually is the character who says, I can, I will, I must. The terror person is the person who responds out of, I don't want that to happen to me. So this is the girl who wants to be with the popular kids. She's afraid of humiliation. This is when Lindsay Lohan falls in the trash can in Mean Girls, right? And it's like, oh, bad things happen to pretty people. That's funny. But it also speaks to this idea of people who respond, all their choices and actions come out of a sense of fear. And running away from something, not going off in quest with an open heart, but constantly reacting to the world. That's the terror character. So again, these are just 4 filters you can run through. And then what I do is I usually, once I've gotten this far, I try to come up with a 1-sentence description for my characters. And this is just like the theme and the premise, is that these are the 2 leads from my graphic novel at the front. Okay, so for these guys, I came up with thirsty. Cynical on the outside, optimistic on the inside. So that's a short way of saying that in daily life, he is a whiner. He complains about a lot of things. He's always saying, oh, woe is me. But when the chips are down, when there's a crisis, he rises to the occasion. Deep down, he's an optimistic guy, and he is full of hope and wants to make the world a better place. Now, conversely, you have Knox, who is optimistic on the outside and cynical on the inside, which means in day-to-day life, he's the guy who's going to find $50 on the ground for no reason at all. Everybody likes him, but in a crisis, he's going to climb the tallest tree, and he is useless in a bad situation, or next to useless in a bad situation. So in this way, these 2 characters are foils, and we get to explore that through the conflict of the story. Okay, well, thank you guys, and we'll get to work.